Wonderful to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you tonight. We're back to the roaring 20s, and we're going to move from Dvinsk in present-day Latvia to Vilna in present-day Lithuania. Okay. Last week we talked about the rugged Shavar Gaon, and almost contemporaneous, they surely knew each other, almost contemporaneous with the rugged Shavar Gaon was the topic of tonight's class, Reb Chaim Ozer Grzinski. So I actually want to start at the end and then return to the beginning. I sort of timed it intentionally so that we'd be talking about Reb Chaim Ozer on the week of Parshas Tetzaveh. Reb Soloveitchik gave in some circles, a famous eulogy shortly after the passing of Reb Chaim Ozer in August 1940 at a rabbinic convention, a Gouda convention in Cincinnati. The Parsha talks about the Shmona Begadim, the special vestments, the 8 special vestments. There's the regular 4 vestments of the Kohen and 4 additional vestments of the Kohen Gadol. And the Rav, Reb Soloveitchik, in eulogizing Reb Chaim Ozer Grzinski, talked about the tzitz and the choshen, and I have it for you on the source sheet. I won't pull it up, but if you'd like to look at it, it's in Hebrew, but it's in a beautiful and relatively understandable Hebrew. And the Rav said the following. He said, the Kohen Gadol wears the tzitz on his forehead. And he wears the choshen on his chest opposite his heart. He said it's the job of the Kohen Gadol to rule on matters of Isser v'Heter and Tumah v'Tara, to make halachic decisions and to issue piskei halacha. He said that's the tzitz, that's the cognitive, intellectual side to Jewish leadership. And he said then there's the choshen, which is worn on the heart, and embedded are the 12 stones representing all 12 tribes. And it's the beged of the Kohen Gadol that's responsible for helping decide matters of public policy. And it's like a refrain in the eulogy. He says, Eleh o lo eleh. The choshen helps the Jewish people decide, do we go forward or do we stay back? Do we participate or do we advance? Do we join? Do we protest? Do we adopt something new? Do we reject it? And he said this was Reb Chaim Ozer. He was the undisputed Gadol Hador of pre-war European Jewry. He had this prodigious mind, prodigious intellect, a capacity to render psak on all the pressing issues of the day, as we'll see. The cognitive, the intellectual, the tzitz, and at the same time, the choshen, with the 12 tribes embedded on his heart, he was responsible for public policy matters of the Jewish people writ large. And he said for so long in the course of Jewish history, these responsibilities were divided. You had a great rabbi who'd be responsible for halachic issues, and then you'd have the layperson, the politician, who would handle the political issues. And the Rav said, the ideal model is the Kohen Gadol, the embodiment of both the halachic and the political. They didn't have to be separate. They could be combined. They could adhere in one person. And he said this was Reb Chaim Ozer. This is what the world lost when he died in 1940, a massive and towering Talmid Chacham who addressed all the halachic issues of his day, and at the same time, a public leader who addressed questions of politics and policy on the world stage. Okay, so with that introduction, I'll just show you. I have it at the top of the source sheet. There's many pictures of Reb Chaim Ozer, and I chose this one because this is what they say about Reb Chaim Ozer. This was always his expression. He was just the most genial, cordial, happiest person, and there was always just this beaming smile radiating from Reb Chaim Ozer. So, usually you see these pictures of Gedolim, they're so severe and stern, and the head is in the sefer. Reb Chaim Ozer has the sefer, and he's just beaming. Like, wouldn't you love to get a hug from Reb Chaim Ozer? Okay, so Reb Chaim Ozer was born in 1863 in a little village, like the Rogachover, born in a village that we never heard of. The Rogachover was born in Rogachov. Reb Chaim Ozer was born in a little shtetl called Ivya, and like the Rogachover, he was a child prodigy. He was called the Ilui of Ivya, the genius of Ivya, even at a very young age. Everyone recognized that this kid had super special talents and a super special memory. In 1883, at a relatively young age, there are all kinds of stories. There's much that's been written about him. And if you Google it, you could find more on any of the issues that I mentioned in the course of this talk. But there was a great dispute or debate or even a court case over who should be entitled to have their daughter marry Reb Chaim Ozer. In the end, it was the granddaughter of Rabbi Yisrael Salanter who married Reb Chaim Ozer when he was 20 years old. I'll just say kind of parenthetically that he had a tragic family life. He and his wife had only one daughter. She became terribly ill at the age of 16 and perished at the age of 20, quite tragically. He became, at a super young age, at the age of 23, he became the Dayan of Vilna. Okay, so let me just pause, because really the rest of the story for the next, almost 60 years is going to take place in Vilna. So if you remember, we talked about Dvinsk, just to put it in context, because we were in Dvinsk last week. So, I think I said that at its peak around 1900, there were, 50,000 Jews in Dvinsk, and almost half the city was Jewish, and had every kind of Jew represented there. So Vilna, just multiply by 2. Okay, so there's 100,000 Jews. Again, something like, I think even more than half the city was Jewish by the turn of the century. I think I had said there were 40 functioning shuls in Dvinsk. In Vilna, there's 100, right? 100 functioning shuls and yeshivas. And again, sort of as we spoke about last week, there's Bundists and there's Bolsheviks and there's Zionists and there's secularists and there's traditionalists and there's yeshiva students, and they're all here in this city of Vilna. I'll just say also kind of parenthetically, if you're interested in Vilna, so YIVO, was based in Vilna. So and virtually all of YIVO and their collections were saved. It's a story for its own telling, but online you could go on on 16th Street and just visit. It's worth visiting. The collections are extraordinary. But even online, if you could look up anything you want. And they have wonderful, entries and photographs and documents. And if you just have half an hour and you're interested in learning about, anything about, Eastern Europe, but particularly Vilna, so YIVO is an extraordinary resource. So I just picked one photograph to share with you because I thought it was a great photograph. It's at the top of your source sheet. This has nothing to do with Reb Chaim Ozer specifically, but it's just an image, and I think it's always just powerful to see the people and to see the faces. So this is a yeshiva in Vilna. It's called the Tiferes Bachrim Yeshiva, and I happened to be one of the important people of the yeshiva in 1938. Was leaving for Palestine, and they made like a going away party, something like that. And you could just see like who's in this yeshiva, and you have people with beards and people who are clean shaven, and some people are wearing certain kind of hat, and some people were not wearing any hat, and they're all sitting together as representatives of this yeshiva in the city of Vilna. So everything in Vilna is always in the shadow of the Vilna Gaon. Okay, he died in 1797, but basically forevermore, no one would ever take the position of like chief rabbi of Vilna, because they like, we just can't do it. Like, compared to the Vilna Gaon, who am I? Who is that? Like, impossible. Nobody could ever hold a candle to the Vilna Gaon. So they just functioned like without a head, in deference to the Vilna Gaon. After the death of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, who we talked about, as the, anything named Yisrael is because it was a Musar yeshiva. Anything named Yitzchak Elchanan was a non-Musar yeshiva because Yitzchak Elchanan was the Gadol Hador until he passed away in 1896. After 1896, after the death of Rabbi Yitzchak Elchanan, so Reb Chaim Ozer, even though he's a relatively young man, was acclaimed by everyone as the heir to that tradition. He became the undisputed Gadol Hador, and he was offered, right, unheard of. He was offered to become essentially the chief rabbi of Vilna. He said, "No, I can't do that. Not the Vilna Gaon, and only the Vilna Gaon could fill that role." But nonetheless, he became the, even without the title, the recognized head of Lithuanian Jewry. Over the course of his career, he was offered a number of positions, some of which many people would have considered to be more prestigious or more important. He always refused. He always turned them down. He stayed in Vilna. Vilna is my home, and he was the leader of Lithuanian Jewry. So, just as an example, Shmuel Salant was the head of the Ashkenazic Jewish community in Palestine. And he kept getting older, and every time he would get older, so the community said, well, we have to plan for his eventual death, and so they would think about who would be his successor. So finally, he was already almost 90, I think, around 1900, 1901. So they brought in the Aderet, Reb Eliyahu David Rabinowitz Ta'omim, the father-in-law of Rav Kook, a massive Talmud Chacham. They brought him from Eastern Europe, and they groomed him, and he would be the successor to Shmuel Salant, because he was, he was 60 or something, 30 years younger. And 5-6 years later, he passed away, and Shmuel Salant was still going strong. He lived forever. He lived almost until 100. He died finally in 1909. When he finally passed away, they offered the position to Reb Chaim Ozer, and Reb Chaim Ozer turned it down, and he said, "I'm not leaving," and he never left Vilna. Okay, so as we talked about a little last week, when World War I rolled around, so it was a terrible upheaval for all of European Jewry. You had Jews literally fighting on both sides of the war. And most of Vilna's Jews evacuated and fled to the suburbs, to parts beyond. Reb Chaim Ozer ended up in a town in southern Russia called Ekaterinoslav, something like that. And people continued to write to him, and he continued to respond, and he continued to be the leader of Lithuanian Jewry even in exile. 1919, he returned to Vilna. At that point, Vilna was occupied as a territory by Poland, and he did whatever he could for displaced persons and refugees. And all the while, he continued to respond to halachic questions, which we'll come to in a few minutes. So Rav Soloveitchik, just to tie things back to New York City and the Jewish Center a little. So Rav Soloveitchik was a student in Berlin, as you know, and by the time he was a student in Berlin, his parents had already moved to America. So he is basically on his own, and he would travel regularly from Berlin to Vilna. Reb Chaim Ozer had a long relationship with the Soloveitchik family, and the Rav, as a young man, would travel to see the Gadol Hador and to talk with him in learning. And he always used to say that his meetings with Reb Chaim Ozer were totally exasperating, because he would say, "I have, Rebbe, I want to share with you this chiddush and he would tell Reb Chaim Ozer, what he was thinking in a particular sugya. And you can imagine, this is coming from Soloveitchik, must have been quite extraordinary. And he'd get through his delivery, and Reb Chaim Ozer would say, "No, that's not a chiddush. That's printed right here." And he'd go over his bookshelf and he'd pull out a sefer and he'd say, "That's already printed." Right? And Soloveitchik says this happened every time. He'd think he had the newest, most interesting, most fascinating, most novel idea, and Reb Chaim Ozer, no, it's already been thought of. And like an encyclopedia, he could just literally pull from the shelf the book in which that chiddush already appeared. There's a story they tell that in I think it was 1935. You could check the year. You could just Google it. Reb Chaim Ozer had a telephone in his home or in his office in Vilna, which apparently there weren't too many of them. And they say that one Thursday afternoon, he got a call. His assistant picked up the phone, and they said, it's the family of the Chafetz Chaim calling. And Reb Chaim Ozer didn't pick up the phone. He just said, Baruch Dayan Emes, tell them the funeral should be on Sunday. So the assistant didn't even know, like, how do you know what's happening? So there's just a kind of siman of the quickness and the ability for Chaim Ozer's mind to operate like at lightning speed. So he just deduced, like a Sherlock's home, like a 2-minute mystery. The phone rings and who could be? And I know the answer. So he knew that the Chafetz Chaim had been in failing health. If the family's calling, it's only for one reason. It's because the Chafetz Chaim has passed away. It's Thursday afternoon. And what are they going to ask the Gadol Hador? The question is, should we have the funeral tomorrow because it's supposed to be expeditious, but it's a Friday, and who's going to be able to get there, who can come, and who could stay for Shabbos, and it's going to be a smaller crowd. If we wait till Sunday, we'll be able to, have enough time to get everyone there, and it'll be more kavod Torah. And so, without even knowing the question, without even knowing who, what had happened, Reb Chaim Ozer, gave the psak and said, no, you have to wait. And so it was that the funeral was on Sunday. If we have time, we'll circle back to this. It's perhaps the thorniest issue, of any rabbinic leader that we look back on and talk about in the 1920s and 1930s, and that is, you see the writing on the wall. How could you not tell every person who corresponds with you, every person in your city, every person whose attention you could get? How could you not tell them, get out of here, go to Palestine, run for your lives, right? So if you're Reb Chaim Ozer, and we're looking back and, placing all of what we know onto retrojecting it into the past. So it's the 1920s, it's the 1930s, right? It's not a secret. Anti-Semitism is not like, nobody's hiding it. So why wouldn't you run? And why wouldn't you tell everybody to run? So again, impossible to second guess, and impossible to try to know exactly who knew what, when, and what was possible in a given moment, and what they thought might happen. So we'll circle back to it. But there were different camps. We usually think of the camps in kind of binary terms, like Zionists and anti-Zionists, and that's not wrong. There were Zionists and there were anti-Zionists, but there were also people who historians, I think, accurately describe as like non-Zionists. So they're not Zionists, but they're not like, anti. They're just, they're part of. They're saying, I'm not getting involved in that political fray. And that's where Reb Chaim Ozer really could be identified. He was not a Zionist, but neither was he a rabid anti-Zionist. His brother-in-law, Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, so he was an anti-Zionist. But Reb Chaim Ozer, no, just a non-Zionist. And he actually had very, very warm relationship with Rav Kook, which we'll come to in a second. So Reb Chaim Ozer was always supportive of members of the community who had emigrated to Palestine, And I just mean supportive, like, you make a Mazel Tov announcement on Shabbos morning, but supportive means it's very hard to make ends meet in Palestine. And could you raise money for them and send them money and help literally, support them and keep them going? There's a sort of footnote in history, which was there was a plan at one point, like in the 1920s, to unify the Aguda and the religious Zionists of Mizrahi, and he was supportive of that plan. It never really materialized, as we know, and maybe he was too gentle a person to push for it, more vehemently. But that middle position is where Reb Chaim Ozer, should be identified. So I'll just share with you, because we have it, a correspondence between Rav Kook and Reb Chaim Ozer. And we're going to learn about Rav Kook in a couple weeks. So I'm just going to put up on the screen, if you have the source sheet, this is source number 2. So the background is, I don't know if it exists. I looked for it and couldn't find it, but there's a letter that Rav Kook wrote to Reb Chaim Ozer. So I don't have that letter. And again, I don't know if we have it. I don't know if it exists. It might, and I could keep looking. But what we do have is the response. So the letter from Rav Kook in 1933 was addressed to Reb Chaim Ozer. Rav Kook was again, toward the end of his life, and he wrote to Reb Chaim Ozer in 1933, and he said, "Why don't you move to Israel? Why don't you make Aliyah? And we'll make you the Reish Galusa. Will basically make you like the chief rabbi of Judaism, of the whole world. You'll be the chief rabbi of Israel. You'll be the chief rabbi of world Jewry. You come to Israel, Reb Chaim Ozer." Okay, this is Rav Kook writing to Reb Chaim Ozer, 1933, and we have the response. Right, Reb Chaim Ozer gets the letter, and he responds. He responds to the letter, and he says, "I got your letter, and I got your invitation to come." And I'll just pick up with this paragraph. He says, "Hinei lo ekached mi'ididi." I'm not going to hide it from you, I confess. Ki ha'ra'ayon hazeh minaker b'mochi zeh kama shanim. This idea that I should make Aliyah has been like implanted in my mind for many years. I've been thinking about this. Right? It's not like never considered it. I've been thinking about this for a long time. Asher nafshi yusala esik na listosef b'chatzos heichal Hashem. What a bracha it would be to spend my last years, in the Heichal Hashem in Yerushalayim. Like, what a dream that would be. Aval lidei hachlata lo ba. In the end, it's not going to happen. Basher bedur yatom kasher lazov esklilosenu hayeshivos. He says, I can't do it. It's an orphan generation. The Torah community in Europe needs me, and I want to be there for them. And then he quotes the Yan b'Shailos and Shuvos Maram Shik, Chelek Yoredeya, Masha Heshiv LaGaon Reb Zalman Spitzer Zal, relatively, again, in certain circles, a famous tshuva of the Maram Shik. So the Maram Shik was a student of the Chasam Sofer, so 19th century Hungary. And they're doing battle against the reformers. And there's a young rabbi named Zalman Spitzer who says, I got an invitation. There's a job opening. I could move to Israel. He writes to the Maram Shik, his Rebbe, and he says, should I go? And the Maram Shik says, no, you should stay right here because we need you. It's an important time and there's a lot riding on it. And I don't know what's going on in Israel and who knows what's there, but I do know what's here and you're needed here. She says, it's possible, there might be a lot to do in the Holy Land. Very difficult for me to decide. But at the end of the day, what's here is known to me, and I definitely know that I have a responsibility here. And what I could possibly do in the land of Israel, that's unknown. And Gemara says, "Ein safek motzi midei vadai." The case of doubt can't override what is certain. Okay, and then he goes on to give great brachas to Rav Kook, and ultimately declines to move to Israel. And it's always fascinating to think, like, the counterfactual, what would have happened if he would have left? Maybe others would have followed, who knows? But a fascinating moment in history where Rav Kook and Reb Chaim corresponded, and you see Rav Kook, he's trying to get everybody to Israel, but in the case of Reb Chaim Ozer, he was not successful. I have for you in the next source. It's, you could just look at it. It's a beautiful announcement at a sad moment. 1935, Rav Kook died in 1935, so he was ailing and failing, and at the very end, all the way in Vilna, thousands of miles away, Sir Chaim Ozer made a public service announcement. He says, every shul, every school, every yeshiva has to daven, has to learn, has to do whatever you can for refuah shlema for Rav Kook. And again, sometimes we have this image of like the Zionists, the anti-Zionists, they threw stones at each other. Maybe, but Reb Chaim Ozer and Rav Kook were best friends and very dear to one another, and you could see it in the language and the love and the affection of these letters, this correspondence. So let me pause here for a second, just ask if there are any questions before I turn to some of the communal work of Reb Chaim Ozer. Okay, so as I mentioned, the Tzitz, he's this great rabbinic leader, and the Choshen, to use Rav Soloveitchik's terminology, Reb Chaim Ozer was also this extraordinary political activist and political leader, advocating for Jews throughout Europe and throughout the world. Okay, so 1909, he was among the initiators of a conference that basically resulted in the establishment of a precursor to the Aguda. It was an organization called Knesset Yisrael. And that eventually led to the establishment of the Aguda in 1912. In 1924, he was the initiator of another communal organization. He went to a conference in Grodno that established something called the Vada Yeshivos. And just have to imagine forget the political situation, just the economic situation, economic ruin in the aftermath in the years following World War I for Jews all over Central and Eastern Europe. And every community is struggling and every yeshiva is struggling. And he said, if we pool our resources, we might be able to do a little better. And that's what they did. And they collected money from Jews all over the world to support yeshivas and support communal institutions in his community and whoever needed the funds. Okay, so I'll just share with you again. Sometimes it's an accident of history, to know what survives and what does not. But this is a good one because it's in English, and this doesn't happen all that often. I suspect, and I have an example from the next source. Reb Chaim Ozer didn't speak English, I can assure you, but he had a secretary who, Reb Chaim Ozer would dictate the contents of the letter, or he'd write it in Yiddish, and then it would be transcribed. So here's a letter that is dated 1938, January 29th, 1938, and again you'll see it sort of speaks for itself. Okay, so this is a letter to the Joint Foreign Committee of the Board of Deputies of British Jews. So remember, in England, so they have like a much more centralized system, like the United Synagogue. So, we don't really have that in America, so it always sounds a little foreign to us, but the British community was like, the chief rabbi of Britain, so they have a centralized community. So whoever this is, the leadership, the lay leaders of that community, the Joint Foreign Committee, the Board of Deputies of British Jews. Dear sirs, there are lastly alarming news from Soviet Russia. The government there renewed with great force the persecutions of religion. A great number of rabbis and shochtim have been put in prison or deported to distant parts of Siberia, where they have to endure many privations. So have to endure also their unfortunate families. Those who are not in prison yet dare not write to friends abroad. To mention only a few names, and he mentions, I guess these names, rabbis were known. In the presence of such bad news, I make free to ask you, dear sirs, to kindly see whether by the channel of the Russian embassy in London, anything can be done for the persecuted clergymen. And I hope no useful steps will be wanting on your part in order to save them. Yours very respectfully. Interesting, he did sign his name. So, he at least knew how to write his name in English. probably because he was corresponding often with English speakers to raise money and to write letters like this. So again, just because it's top of mind, but the rugged shaver never wrote a letter like this. That just wasn't his. It wasn't his province. He wasn't involved in affairs like these. But there's a crisis because shochtim in Russia are being sent to Siberia. So who's going to do something about it? Well, I don't know the answer, but Reb Chaim Ozer certainly knew about it. And, if he thought that the position, the people best positioned to do something were the connections between the board of deputies of British Jews and the Russian embassy in London. So he said, take action, man. There probably wasn't a whole lot to do in this moment in 1938. But again, I just share it with you because it's representative of the kind of activities that Reb Chaim Ozer was involved in all the time. I'll give you just one more quick example. There's a set of letters, and again, here you could see it. The original Yiddish is on the right, and then the translation, probably by his secretary, on the left. This was just a couple weeks ago, sold at auction. I forgot to check how much they went for. Probably a couple $1,000s. So this is a story that requires a little background, and I'll just share with you very briefly. It was the story of the Jewish cemetery of Vilna. It was an old cemetery. It had been operating since 1487, and it had been in use since 1831. Okay, and it ran out of space, and they stopped using it. The beginning of the 20th century, it was still active in the sense that people went to visit their deceased relatives who were buried there. It's the Vilna cemetery. I mean, it's where the Vilna Gaon is buried. That's where all the Jews of Vilna had always been buried until the middle of the 19th century. 1935, and again, Vilna is now controlled by Poland. 1935, Polish authorities decided that they were going to demolish the cemetery and build a sports stadium. Because they had adopted a law that said that if a cemetery is not in use for 100 years, so it could be demolished. 1831 was the last time anyone was buried there. It's now 1935. 100 years have passed, and okay, it's legal to demolish the cemetery. So from 1935 until 1940, the community, under the leadership of Reb Chaim Ozer, was in a ongoing, legal and political battle with local officials to do everything that they could to protect their cemetery from being destroyed. Okay. So the issue basically was unresolved, and then World War II happened. It was not a good ending to the story. The cemetery was, preserved during the lifetime of Chaim Ozer, and then during World War II, it was desecrated. And when the Soviets took over in the aftermath of the Second World War, it was not a good continuation of the story either. They removed all the tombstones from the cemetery, and they built a theater. They built a theater on the site, which was the previous site of the Vilna cemetery. Okay, so a sad and tragic story, but again, just a kind of example of there's no Jew, alive or dead, who Reb Chaim Ozer was not advocating for in some capacity during his lifetime. 1936, Reb Chaim Ozer was diagnosed with cancer, and even while his health deteriorated, he continued to act on behalf of the community until his death on August 9th, 1940. You have to ask World War II historians for the exact details of this, but functionally, the Germans only got to Vilna in June 1941. Right? They invaded Poland September 1st, 1939. But for some period of time, the Russians got to Vilna first, and for some period of time, Vilna was in this kind of like interregnum period where it was safe to be a Jew in Vilna. I don't know how this went on, how long this went on for, but at least a period of months, the beginning of the war. And so Jews were fleeing from all parts of Poland and other parts of Lithuania, which is now Poland. They're fleeing to Vilna because it's a quote unquote neutral territory or safe territory. So you could just imagine what Reb Chaim Ozer is doing to help refugees get to someplace safe, and he's dispatching them to all continents using all political connections and all channels, and there's American students, and he's getting them visas to go back home. Whatever could be done in those terrible final months. Okay, and he passed away August 9th, 1940. So I want to talk a little bit now about the works that he left us. But before I do, let me just pause and ask if there are any questions.
I was just can I mention one thing?
Please.
Dr. Lucy Davidowitz, who is a historian of that period, went to Vilna.
Yes.
1938-39 as a fellow for YIVO.
Yes.
And she wrote that book of that time and place, which is a great book. And she writes about Vilna just before, on the eve of World War II.
I'm so glad you brought that up. It's an amazing story. I'll just mention if you're interested. So Lucy Davidowitz she's a graduate student, and she's interested in Yiddish culture, and she went in 1930 as an American student. It's unbelievable. She spent the year at YIVO in 1938, researching and chronicling and whatever. She came back. She made it back to America before the war, and she wrote, so like that's the best preserved story of pre-war Vilna that one could have gotten from a historian. So I'll just say two footnotes. So she has this, I forgot the name of it, but you can Google it and find her book. The two footnotes are, one is there's a brand new biography of her, just came out, I believe, last year. And again, I can find the name of the book, but I think it's a historian at Princeton, if I remember correctly, who wrote a biography. And I'll tell you one more footnote, which is that toward the end of her life in the 1990s, Nancy Davidovitz lived on 86th Street and was a member of the Jewish Center. Okay, so we have to find, it always comes back, I'm telling you, it always comes back to the Jewish Center. So the Achiezer. The Achiezer was the title of Reb Chaim Ozer's books. During his lifetime, he published 3 volumes of his Shilas Uchivos, of his responsa. And it's the anniversary. He published the Achiezer, his first volume, in 1922. And so it's now exactly 100 years since the publication of the Achiezer. And I'll just share with you, because again, you don't see this in other books, but you have to just remember, so massive Talmud Chacham, but also like just a genius as far as public relations and community organizations and political advocacy. So in the introduction to his book, in the introduction to Normal Shilas and Shuvos, so you say something about the title and about you thank Hashem and the ambitions of the work, and Chaim Ozer does all those things, and then he also says, I just want to mention, my friends, in this paragraph, B'yichud niglasa klaster pnei ha'uma. Let me see if I can make out the text here. So Ruach Yisrael Ha'Meir Be'or HaTorah Ve'Avas Chesed Be'Achenu Yelidei Medinasenu Hamiskorim Me'ever Liyam Be'Amerika U'B'Shar Aratzos. Just a shout out. Thank you so much to our brethren. And he goes on, right, to our brethren in America and all over the world, who do everything they can to support us and to support our yeshivos and to support the wonderful Jews of Eastern Europe. So just amazing to see that in print in Vilna by Ruchaim Ozer Gruzinski in 1922. Okay, so let me share with you now a sampling, and I really just want to share. We'll see how much time we have: 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 tshuvos that I hope will give you a flavor for some of the issues that Reb Chaim Ozer was dealing with over the course of his very long rabbinic career. And some of these tshuvos are very resonant, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 years later. So if you look at source number 7, I won't put it on the share screen, but I'll just share with you sort of executive summary. He says, I was traveling and someone stopped me and asked me the following question. He says, there's a particular man, Jewish man, who married a Jewish woman civilly in America. Okay, and it turns out that so the woman is Jewish and the man is not Jewish. Okay, and they got married civilly in America, and now I take it back. It's the opposite. Doesn't matter. But he's Jewish. She's not Jewish. Okay, and now she wants to convert. And they said that if you don't accept them and you don't convert them in this traditional Beis Din, they're going to go to the Reform Beis Din down the block and do a Reform conversion, like a threat. So the only reason that they want to convert is because they want to be married. So what do we do, Reb Chaim Ozer? Are we allowed to allow this person to convert when the only reason they want to convert is because they want to marry into the faith? Okay, sound familiar? Right? How many cases like this do we deal with in the Jewish community in 21st century America? Right? So, the 18th century, rabbis of Europe weren't getting this question, right? It didn't happen that way. But now this is happening, and you have assimilated Jews and acculturated Jews and non-Jews, and what do you do? How do you navigate this? Maze? So Reb Chaim Ozer basically said, in this case, you have to really assess whether or not the Kabbalos or mitzvos is sincere. So the prerequisites for Jewish conversion, if it's a Jewish man, so you need to do bris milah, and in either case, whether man or woman, you need to do tefillah, you go to the mikvah, and you need a kabbalas ol mitzvos. Someone needs to accept the responsibility to perform the mitzvos. The Gemara says, if someone says, I'm going to accept, all the mitzvahs except for one, no, that's not a conversion. So you don't have to go through all 613. We understand it's a journey, but you give them examples of some of the harder ones, some of the easier ones. If someone is generally, willing to accept that responsibility, so then they can convert. And if not, if they say, no, I'm not interested in that. I'm just trying to make my in-laws happy. So, do me a favor and stamp the thing. So Reb Chaim Ozer says you have to be able to assess whether and to what extent the potential convert is really sincere when the question gets asked, do you accept these mitzvahs? And if you can really tell that the whole thing, they're just gaming the system, so that's not going to fly. But if you have reason to believe that, yes, they want to get married, but they're also, have no reason to be deceiving anyone, so then it might be all well and good. In the same tshuva, if you look down, if you have the source in front of you, so this is paragraph Zion. He said, after the revolution, in the aftermath of the first World War, he said what happened is you had a lot of people marrying out and converting out, And he said there were people who came and said, I want to convert because my spouse is Jewish and I want to marry them, and we'll raise our kids Jewishly. And then he adds this caveat. He says, and if not, I'm out of here. And and the Jewish spouse says, and I'm going to go the other way, and they'll take me at the church. So my way or the highway. It's this ultimatum. You can either let the non-Jewish spouse convert to Judaism and we'll have a Jewish family, or you can refuse and the other of us will convert to Christianity and we'll have a Christian family. So, Rabbi, what do you say? Right. So, what do you do in this very difficult situation? And again, Reb Chaim Ozer in those cases tended to be relatively lenient, to the extent that one could ascertain that they were actually committed to raising a Jewish family. And again, you could sort of understand and appreciate the massive implications of these kinds of halachic decisions when you start to think about some of the questions that have come up over the last 20, 30 years in Israel with Ethiopian immigrants and Russian immigrants, and questions of questionable conversions and non-Orthodox conversions. And again, right, so whatever the answer is, you have to contend with the positions of the Achiezer and the Chuvos that he wrote, which were at the time quite revolutionary. Let me just share with you in the last few minutes that we have a couple of the other, again, just a few highlights. I have this in source number 8. So again, you wouldn't have gotten this question necessarily in the 18th century. In source number 8, he asks the following question: Al das. So I think let me see if I can share this on the screen. This is source number 8, and he was asked about Kohanim duchening. Okay, so he said the following question: Al das she'ilasa b'nogea lebitul nesias kapayim lepisha Kohanim al pirov machale Shabbos. He says, what if you have somebody they're not from, they violate Shabbos, and can they duchen? Okay, but tzedek ha'ir ki al yedei zeh yachol etzes kilkul ki yishkechu legamrei shehem kohanim. And the questioner says, if I don't, I have a shul and I'm asking you, Reb Chaim Ozer, what should I do in my shul? And he says, if I don't let them duchen, so they're going to basically neglect their identity as kohanim. And vayusu nashim hapsuls the kohanim v'gam yutmu as atzman l'meisim. He says over time they're just not going to have that identity, because the kid's never going to go to shul with the dad and say I duchen because I'm a, and so they're going to marry people who are prohibited to them, and they're going to go to cemeteries where they shouldn't be. So what do? He says v'yesh lamar ki hem kitinok shenishba ben hanachim. So he used a very important formulation, which had been popularized by Yaakov Ettlinger, by the Binyan Sion, who said at some point, so you have to just assume that these people are in the category of a tinuk shenishba. The halacha category that the Gemara says, if someone was captured as a child by non-Jews and raised in that environment, so what are you going to throw them? Throw the book at them because they violate Shabbos? They never heard of Shabbos. they weren't educated about that. It's not like they said, "Oh, I reject Shabbos." No, they didn't grow up with it. So what could you want from them? How could you possibly expect anything different? So he says it's the same thing. These people have no Jewish education. They're not living in a Jewish environment by and large. So somebody is Machal Shabbos, like how much can you hold that against them? Better to let them duchen, even though maybe the letter of the law is that's a problem. He says, I'm going to let it go because the consequences of not letting it go, right, are going to be so devastating. And again, you could see sort of the political calculus, not just the halacha calculus, maybe in letter of the law. So, somebody asks, is Machal Shabbos? Maybe the answer is no. But he says, in the grand sweep of things, given the political realities of this moment, much more important to, maybe make a small sacrifice on this issue and think about what could be gained on the larger issue. Another fascinating tshuva he has, I'll just give you kind of quick hits as we run out of time. But there's a fascinating question in the Gemara. To what extent are you allowed to jeopardize your own life to try to extend your life? Okay, so the doctor says, this person has a terrible illness, and if we don't intercede, they only have a month to live. We could do this surgery, but it's very risky. 60% chance of 60% of the time, the patient dies on the table. So are you allowed to go through with that surgery? Right? Maybe you would say that, well, if it's a 98% chance of success, you could go through with that surgery. That's one thing. But if it's less than 50%, maybe I can't do that. So Reb Chaim Ozer says you can. It's the discretion of the patient, and a patient is allowed to make that decision and risk, longer life, more life. Risk his own possible death on the operating table for the possibility that his life could be extended. In the early parts of the 20th century, there's a raging debate about the status of electricity in halacha, with all kinds of consequences. So there were a number of poskim who said, a number of very important poskim, who said electricity on Yantif. So the current is going around; it's everywhere, and you could turn on an electric light on Yantif. It's no problem. You're not lighting anything. You can't turn it off. Everyone would say you can't turn it off, but to turn it on, you're just kind of transferring the same way that you can transfer a flame to one of the. That's all you're doing when you turn on when you flip the light switch. So Reb Chaim Ozer had a different position. We don't hold that way, but there were Gedolim who did. So Reb Chaim Ozer had a different position, and he said no, it's Eish. He said that it's really a problem. You can't flip the light switch on Shabbos. We don't hold this way either. But he said you can't flip the light switch on Shabbos because you're really creating a fire. The filament generates light and it generates heat, and it has all the qualifications of an Eish. And somebody who does that, it's as if you lit a match. It's not any different. Rav Soloveitchik said sometimes he'd go visit Reb Chaim Ozer, and after Shabbos, Reb Chaim Ozer would make Havdalah, and he would flip the switch. Instead of lighting a candle, he would make Borei Mere Ha'esh on the incandescent bulb, just to demonstrate the degree to which he really believed this position, that the filament is really fire, and you could say a bracha Borei Mere Ha'esh. By the way, we rely on this. We still prefer to use a candle, but if you're in a pinch and you didn't make Havdalah and you don't have a candle, if you have an incandescent, it's harder to find these days because everything is like LED. But if you have an incandescent bulb, that's perfectly fine. You could make same thing. Somebody's in the hospital and they have the electric lights, on a Friday night. So you could light your Shabbos candles totally fine to rely on this position and make a bracha. Before Shabbos on electric lights, or for Borei Mere Ha'esh at Havdalah. I'll share with you one final position of the Reb Chaim Ozer, and then I'll conclude with one last story. Also, you never would have gotten this question before the 20th century, but there's this new invention called gelatin. Okay, and this one is a very old controversy, but gelatin is produced from bone. Okay, so don't ask me for the whole chemical process, not my area of expertise, but you could use animal bones, you could use fish bones. So, this is the derivation of gelatin. So can you use bones of a non-kosher animal? And Reb Chaim Ozer said, yes. That's perfectly fine, as long as they're batal b'shishim, as long as the volume of the gelatin is overwhelmed by a ratio of 60-1, factoring in a number of other issues. It's no problem to use gelatin which is derived from a non-kosher animal. Okay, this is a big deal. It's like the Gadol Hador, Chaim Ozer Grzinski, saying that this is okay. In the end, over time, these debates got settled, and that's not our practice anymore. The conservative movement actually adopted this position. I don't know if they adopted other positions of Reb Chaim Ozer, but this one they attached themselves to. The Orthodox position, the mainstream Orthodox position, has been now for a number of decades that we don't rely on this, and the bones have to be, the gelatin has to be derived from animals or fish that are kosher. But fascinating, to see how Reb Chaim Ozer was processing these very kind of cutting edge and new issues. I'll just conclude with one final story because we're almost out of time. I once shared with you the beautiful story of Rav Gustman. Rav Gustman was must have been 50, 60 years younger than Reb Chaim Ozer. He was born in 1908, so he's 50 years younger. But he was like a rising star, really a wonderful and brilliant student of Reb Chaim Ozer in Vilna in the 1930s. The story that I shared with you, you should Google him, read his biography. Rav Gustman had an extraordinary life, a tragic life. His family was murdered by the Nazis. His son was murdered in front of him. And he escaped, and he survived the war. He had to join the partisans, and the only way to join the partisans is if you had a weapon. He killed a Nazi with his own bare hands so he could get the weapon and join the partisans. He lived in the forest. He fought with the extraordinary story. And the story that I told you was that after the war, he came to America. He ended up in Israel, and he had a yeshiva in Yerushalayim. And in the yeshiva in Yerushalayim, there was a garden. And Rav Gustman was the gardener. He tended the garden in the yeshiva. And one of the students once asked Rav Gustman, like, Rebbe, we could do it. We could hire someone. It's like not so becoming for the Rosh Yeshiva to be the gardener. And Rav Gustman said, no, I'll tell you why I tend the garden. I tend the garden because I have hakaras hatov for the plants, because they saved my life. He says when I was running from the Nazis in the forest outside of Vilna, so I survived eating the shrubbery and whatever I could, the berries and the mushrooms, from the forest. So all these years later, in appreciation for the plants and the berries saving my life, I'm more than happy to tend to the garden in the yeshiva. So the piece that I don't think I shared with you is the prologue to that story. So Rav Gustman said before the war, he was walking with Reb Chaim Ozer in the forest outside of Vilna. It's actually the forest where most of Vilna's Jews were executed by the Nazis and their collaborators. So before the war, he was walking with Reb Chaim Ozer in the forest, and Reb Chaim Ozer said, "Oh, you see that? You see that mushroom? That's an edible mushroom." He said, "You see that mushroom? That's not an edible mushroom." And on and on, this plant and that mushroom. And Rav Gustman said at the time, I didn't know what was happening. It was surreal. The Rosh Yeshiva is telling about the mushrooms and the plants. I couldn't understand. And then years later, during the war, when I had to live in that forest, I remember the conversation, and I began to appreciate what it is that Chaim Ozer was educating me about, so that I would be able to survive in these impossible conditions. Long after Reb Chaim left this world, his students, his teachings, and his legacy of leadership endure. And I hope that just this short time together was enough to get a flavor for who this man was. And I hope we'll have opportunities to return to his teaching and to his extraordinary life on other occasions. Please God, we'll pick up with the series next week at this time, and we'll be talking about Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein, the author of the Torah Tamima, and I look forward to seeing you then. I'm going to stop the recording, but I'm happy to stay on and take any questions or comments.